Perfect.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the new international webinar series titled New Leisure Studies, International Perspectives. We are excited to have you here to talk about climate change in the leisure industry. And we have guests from all over the world joining us today. And cheers to those that are experiencing happy hour here in the United States or North America. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that this land, since I'm hosting from University of Utah, my name is Kelly Bricker, and I'd like to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is a traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and federal government, and we affirm that the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. This webinar today is organized by a group of 7 leisure organizations from around the world. I'd like to give a shout out to the Australian and New Zealand Association of Leisure Studies, the Canadian Association for Leisure Studies, the China International Leisure Research Association, Leisure Studies Association, the Sociology of Leisure, the Academy of Leisure Sciences, and the World Leisure Organization. For TALS, this initiative started as an outcome of a strategic meeting a few years back. And when the organization, we made a commitment to connect and work closely with our peer organizations from across the world, considering how multidimensional and global most of these issues discussed in the leisure field are today. We thought that working on a solution will be done more effectively if we work outside our country's borders. Similar sentiments were expressed simultaneously by other organizations around the world, and this collaboration was started. The goal of this series is to bring together scholars from around the world to discuss practical solutions to the most pressing issues in leisure, because we believe that together we can achieve better outcomes. We encourage you to register for our future webinar, and we'll put that probably in the chat, and we'll be marketing that a couple of weeks before it happens, but the next one will take place on January 29th. The details will be circulated through all the listservs of these 7 organizations. Today, I'd like to thank my co-host, Mona Mary, and from Indiana University and Purdue University in Indianapolis, and Irna Sharaviska and Jasmine Vanadore from Clemson University. Just a few announcements before we get to the real heart of the matter today. You can please place your questions in the chat box, and we will try and get to all of them during this time together. And we are also recording the meeting today, so you can have it as a record for future reference. I should probably be advancing these slides. So I'd like to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers today, and their bios are in a link that we will provide in the chat as well. And I think going in alphabetical order, we have Dr. Suzanne Becken, who's a professor of sustainable tourism at Griffith Institute for Tourism, Griffith University in Australia, and she'll be representing ANZELS. We have Dr. Matthew Brownlee, Associate Professor in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at Clemson University, representing TALS. We have Dr. Daniel Scott, Professor and University Research Chair of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo in Canada, representing CALS. And Dr. Lalo Marafa, Professor and Geographer of Geography and Resource Management at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, representing the WLO. We also have Dr. Qiao Qiao, assistant professor in the School of Community Resources and Development at Arizona State University in the United States, representing SILRA, don't like acronyms, and Dr. Kofan Lee, associate professor of health, exercise, science, and recreation management at the University of Mississippi, representing RC13. I will now stop sharing, and if we can all just give a welcome to our guests today. And thank you all for being here. So I'd like to kick off this panel discussion with a question about the major climate change issues in your individual countries today. So under that broad idea, can you tell us whose quality of life is most being affected by these changes, and how are they or will they impact the leisure industry in your respective countries? Kofan, you are to my left, and I'm seeing that beautiful sunset in San Francisco, so please kick us off.
Sure, thank you, Kelly. So although I have this San Francisco as my virtual background, I'm still in Oxford, Mississippi. So I want to briefly talk about what's the pricing issue in Taiwan, which is my hometown. So I was looking at the research report released in 2017. We pretty much get all kinds of impacts from the climate change, in addition to just besides the glacier receding, because glacier has been long gone in Taiwan. So recently we suffer from the unpredictable variable precipitation patterns. So that means we may get more rainfalls in the rainy year, and we get more drier during those dry years. So and also we got more strong rainfalls. So that means that all the rainfall are concentrated in one day, and that has been become a really great impact to our areas, to Taiwan. So you can see flooding in certain areas, like the coastal area, and their land is below the sea levels, so sometimes they get floods. However, some other areas, like my hometown, that's a southwest side of the plain area, we got drought. So the impacts are somehow different, and that's the major issues. And in addition to that, the rising temperature is also another important issue. So compared to the average, our temperature has been rise for 1.3 degrees Celsius. So that, again, to many leisure participants who want to do their activity outdoor, that's a potential threat leading to the heat-related illness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's go over to Hong Kong. Lowell.
Yes. Well, to me, it's good morning again to all of you. This is 6 a.m. And also, I'm very glad to be here to share. I wear two hats. I'm living in Hong Kong for more than 20 years. So naturally, that's home away from home. Originally from Nigeria. Now, if you look at climate change globally, and so I will specifically look at Hong Kong as well, and then slightly touch on Africa. There is inconsistencies that I will say in terms of precipitation. That's rainfall, and then of course changes in temperature, and we have been experiencing a little bit of extremity, and so in these situations, when you look at leisure participation, and I'm looking at leisure generic time, but specifically with the outdoor recreation and leisure activities, and so across the board, the quality of life of people, particularly those, and I want to say that, you know, there is those who participate and there is basically those who just accompany. We can basically have a cross-section, you know, of effects, or if you like, a cross-section of influence that these changes in climate change, you know, brings. And I might leave it there and then move on a little bit later. On the African continent, we are also, you know, looking at a broad spectrum, you know, of changes. You find an extreme area where you have, if you like, dry environment, and, you know, lack of, you know, adequate rainfall, you know, and so on, and going down to places where you have extremely heavy rainfall, you know, that has been, you know, appearing. So if you are looking at, you know, people who are, you know, leisure people, people who are looking at the outdoors, you know, both for participation and to some extent for survival, then such people are essentially being, you know, affected. And if we go into segmentation, then, you know, there are those who do leisure, you know, near home, and there are those who actually travel a bit, you know, to participate. And so in both cases, extremes in climate change, extremes in precipitation, extremes in temperature can be a major factor. I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move down under and hear from our friends in Australia. Susan?
Well, kia ora everyone, and good morning, actually from New Zealand. So my image that you can see is New Zealand, and I am in New Zealand. And I might still speak a little bit for Australia as well, but I'm currently working part-time for the New Zealand government for the Department of Conservation. And of course, while the key mandate is around conservation and biodiversity protection, the other half is really about enabling leisure and outdoor recreation in our national parks. So that's just for context, but maybe in terms of the key impacts, I might just mention two, apart from we obviously get our fair share of extreme weather events, and the previous panelists mentioned extreme rainfall. So we get that both in New Zealand, Australia increasingly, but the one that's sort of getting more imminent is sea level rise. And we just had some research coming out in New Zealand that looked at the impact on housing, and that would be the same in Australia, because both countries really have much of their infrastructure on the coast. And one of the banks estimated that at least 2 or 3% of all mortgages are exposed for their property and sea level rise, and that potentially in 15 years, those kinds of houses will become uninsurable. And that really affects the sort of quality of life of the really poorest people, in the sense that it's an existential problem. But the other cohort, I guess, is second home holiday house owners, which is a big thing. And funnily enough, with the COVID crisis, people have been buying holiday homes like crazy. And those holiday homes are preferably on the coast. So in some ways, there's a bit of a problem. But the other one that's really important to mention is fire risk. And that's something that we're also really concerned about in the government, because Australia, I don't even have to say much. You've seen it last year, and I spoke to a colleague who is in New South Wales. He said there's already 50 fires. The conditions are basically the same that they were 12 months ago. It's been 46 degrees there with very dry, hot winds. They're very concerned. But the interesting thing is that in New Zealand now, where I've been here over 20 years, fire risk was not necessarily on our agenda, but it is now. The government estimates that it will either double or triple in the future with higher temperature and drier conditions. And we had some major fires actually already in winter, destroying about 50 holiday homes. And that's a safety concern also for people who go out there hiking to our huts. That's, I think, something that New Zealand has to think very quickly about how to address that. So I stop here.
Thank you. And Xiao from Arizona State.
Hello, hello everyone. I am actually located in Hainan now. As the impact of climate change on leisure industry, I will primarily talk about two perspectives. So one of the impact of climate change on leisure industry, I think, one of the projects that I've been recently working on is also about the climate change impact on cultural resources in coastal recreation area, which, you know, the climate extremes, like the natural hazard, storms, hurricanes, flooding, and erosion, posed a great threat for the cultural resources, such as the historical buildings in national seashores, and the historical buildings, fortifications, and batteries. Their conditions continues to decay because of due to the climate extremes, and some of them even have the risks to fall down to the water. And unfortunately, most of the cultural resources are kind of non-renewable, and the U.S. National Park Service are kind of facing the insufficient funding to maintaining all of those kind of historical resources under climate change. And this is putting the risks for the conservations for cultural heritage, but also making a lot of those historical buildings be suspended for use potentials, including visitor use and third party use. And on the other hand, I think many other panelists have mentioned that climate change has bringing challenges for the recreationists for participating in many recreation activities. For example, one of our recent projects about climate change impact on Vermont State Park visitors has found that those extremely high temperature and low temperature, increasing biting insects and increasing raining days has serving as external barriers for visitation, and visitors are started to substitute some of their recreation activities, and also some substitution behaviors has been made by visitors to adapt to climate change. So I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Dr. Scott.
Sure, I'll give a Canadian perspective, and then we share some of the same impacts that we've observed with our colleagues in the States. So I might hear the similar things from them on a regional basis. Because both of our countries are so large, we really do have different regional implications. If I start on our west coast around Vancouver, we've seen in the last couple of years, as Suzanne already mentioned, forest fires, the air quality that they've had, the implications for visual implications for tourism, but even just urban recreation. Kids sports had to be canceled. Runners were getting air quality advisories. And 2 years ago, it was because of fires in the interior of British Columbia, in part that was caused by mountain pine beetle infestations killing parts of the forest. But the last year, it was actually smoke coming from California, Oregon, Washington, up into Vancouver and into that basin that way. And if we come further east into the region I'm near Toronto, in the Great Lakes region, we've had substantial fluctuations in the last 5 to 7 years in the Great Lakes water levels, from very low to now high, depending on precipitation, but the functionality of everything from marinas to what kind of beach space you have left has real implications for some of our parks. Around here, we've had a couple in the last several years, fairly warm Christmas seasons. So green, no skiing being able to open on a couple of those years. And that's part of a broader pattern in the United States, for example, because you guys have better data. Over the last 30 to 30 years, we were always seeing ski seasons get longer and longer and longer. And because of snowmaking investment this last decade, that's switched for the first time. So seasons are now getting shorter. Even with that big investment in adaptation, we're seeing similar things here in Canada, not quite to the same extent there. And then if we go to our Atlantic coast, we share the same sort of hurricane risk, not near.
Looks like we have a bit of freezing going on. Daniel, can you hear us? Okay, we'll come back to Daniel if we're able and move over to Dr. Brownlee Matthew from Clemson.
Hi, everyone. What an honor to be here today with the rest of these panelists. Impressive group of people. Welcome, everybody. So I'm gonna take a little bit of a different approach to answering the question about the challenges experienced in the United States due to climate change. And to set that stage a little bit, I'm going to change my background here. And I'll say that one of the challenges in the United States is that we release more climate change pollution as a country than any other country. We currently rank #1 per capita, #2 overall on climate change contributions. And however, depending on whatever metrics you use, the US is either the wealthiest or one of the wealthiest countries, but large wealth disparities exist. So effectively, the United States, would need to make some major measures equivalent to reducing by about 195% of our gas emissions of its 2005 emissions to reach levels appropriate at 2030. Essentially, the US is just not doing their fair share here in the global action on climate change. The US is a significant contributor. We produce externalities for many others. We have means to do something about it, but comparable to other nations, we're not doing as much. Now, I love the United States, but I am not proud of the way that we've been addressing climate change. I think there's general challenges for everybody in climate change. It's different. A lot of it's different from other environmental issues because of the scale, the uncertainty, the complexity, the temporal delays and ethical considerations. Sometimes our traditional decision-making techniques and conventional governance paradigms and even some of our economic utility models are not easily adapted to the climate change scenario, and sometimes they don't really offer the best solutions either. One of the major challenges in the United States is public support, and that's both attitudinally and behaviorally. And I will put something into the chat box here that I encourage folks to check out now or later. But Yale University has done a fine job tracking the public sentiment and belief in climate change over time. Many of you guys are probably familiar with it. Currently, 72% of US citizens believe that climate change is happening, but only 60% believe that it's human caused, and only 53% think there is scientific consensus. However, as a big country, there's a lot of sectors in the US where those numbers go down to about 40% of residents in certain counties believing that climate change is happening. So that's a major issue. It influences our political landscape and national initiatives or lack thereof, and it becomes a real limiting variable in a lot of ways. So I want to scale this down a bit, and I want to talk about the human experience with climate change, because I think that provides some significant challenges. So I'm going to talk about a couple psychological, human evolutionary, and social ecological processes that influence beliefs, attitudes, and behavior towards climate change. These are kind of in the context of the United States, but I think one thing we have in common here today is we're all humans. And so some of this stuff will hopefully apply internationally for sure. So there's several examples of processes that really compel us as humans to ignore evidence that's contrary to our beliefs. And we see that in things like cognitive dissonance and bias assimilation, or our ability to leverage other information sources to support our belief, even if those information sources are less than factual. We know that there's a loss aversion of humans, that People become attached to their current level of prosperity and feel entitled to maintain that status. And all of these things end up influencing climate change beliefs. We know that from the heuristics literature or cognitive shortcuts that they play their part too. So for example, one of the challenges in climate change is the availability heuristic that tells us that humans essentially judge the probability or frequency of a future events based on the ease with which they can imagine that event, recalling that event in the present or in the past. And so these predictions and novel predictions of climate change, such as unprecedented drought or never witnessed sea level rise, many people struggle to imagine that. And in turn may ultimately conclude that climate change is unlikely to occur. You know, in short, we're kind of prisoners of our own experience. The other thing that I want to point out is that natural selection has really favored our species and favored individuals that did not worry about slow, gradual change. We, you know, as a result, our capacity to notice slow, gradual change is limited in society. And that's why time-lapse photography and those things are such powerful tools, because they help us to overcome that innate challenge. Some authors and researchers go further and assert that we're biologically predisposed and highly sensitive to only short-term and extreme environmental change, such as scarcity of food or scarcity of water. So I don't necessarily see all of these challenges as environmental impacts. I see the challenges within. Those challenges come from who we are as humans. And some of that comes from human ecology, evolutionary biology. Some of it comes from psychosocial processes and psychological processes. One of the final ones that I would like to note is the concept of shifting baseline or generational amnesia, which allows us as a society to take increasingly degraded conditions as a baseline or the norm. And so, you know, this in the background here, this youngster walking across a lake may take those conditions as normal when perhaps that individual's grandmother would say that that is abnormal. But becoming increasingly used to those conditions is a challenge. I'll stop there, but I think the challenge lays within is my answer.
Thank you, Matt. And before we go on to the next question, Daniel, we were cut off from your wisdom a bit. Was there anything else you'd like to add? I don't know if you know when you were cut off, but
I don't know at what point I disappeared either. But I'll just say, you know, in a Canadian, but in an American context too, unlike some parts of the world where there's often no upside to climate change in terms of what it means for tourism or recreation leisure, we have mixed impacts. You know, our winter season versus our summer season, we can gain some green season. We get parks. We're seeing that adaptation in park visitation, golf seasons, et cetera, here, while we're losing on the other side. And then within each of those markets, whenever we've looked at regional markets, typically there's winners and losers within that. And that's part of what we need to, as researchers, try to identify and help those communities begin the process of adaptation and address all the challenges Matt just talked about. The more we can get that information out to municipal councillors, et cetera, earlier, the more time they have for adaptation. So that's always been our goal.
well, great. That's a great segue actually into the next question. And I'd like everyone to think about how leisure research, the types of research that you all are doing and many others across the world, can best address these issues and have really the most impact on what we're facing today. And I think what we'll do is kick it off with our New Zealand guest. I apologize for that. I made a big assumption there. Suzanne, would you like to kick it off, please?
Okay. Well, and maybe here I draw on my government role, because it's actually very real, and we have a climate change adaptation plan now, And that will be accompanied by a climate change adaptation science plan. And we are literally thinking, what does this mean? And it's a combination of some obviously biophysical science to really understand the risk of landslide and so on, but then it's the social science and the economics. And so then we sort of, as we try to progress that, we figured out it's sort of either a matter of economics or behavior and risk perception. In terms of economics, we're faced with decisions, and many of you would have similar questions. So when do you retreat from somewhere? So how much money do we put into a track that we know gets washed out every year? When do you stop? Or how much budget do we allocate to now that we have to fly people out when they get stranded for various sort of climate or weather situations? So is it just a matter of cost? But other than that, it's manageable risk. It's just an economic implication. Or is there a point where something is either a threshold that we don't understand the implications, so it's not just an economics, or there's a real risk to life? And that's where then the next question is, to what extent is the individual responsible? In which case research really needs to address people's knowledge and decision-making and preparedness, or to what extent are we, in that case, as the provider of tracks and huts and so on, responsible? And that would require more research into our warning systems, our communication. So this is a very sort of multi-dimensional answer, but I guess it reflects that there's actually lots of research opportunities and needs, and it depends what the main problem is and who the I guess target audience is. But in some, it's probably a mix of some more biophysical modeling and climate impacts. For example, water availability is the big one for us too, economics and behavioral science. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a great opening answer for everybody else to chew on a little bit. Xiao, how about, I heard from your answer that a lot of your focus is on cultural resources. Are you addressing some interesting questions around that?
Yes, Kelly. So we have engaged in one of the National Park Service funded projects about the cultural resources adaptation planning under climate change for the past few years, and we have conducted our research in Cape Lookout National Seashore and Gulf Island National Seashore for 2 sites until now. And what the most challenging questions that we are facing is the insufficient maintenance budget to for the cultural adaptation planning for a lot of the cultural resources along the coastal national park service areas. So, under the insufficient budget and also the increasing climate change impact, we are using the optimization model to prioritize the needs for the climate adaptation actions for different types of the cultural resources, such as the historical buildings, fortifications, batteries, and also continue considering how the climate change will influence the historical value, use potential, and vulnerability to those historic cultural resources across a long-term planning period, which is 30-year planning horizon. So using those prioritizing or optimization model, allowing us to evaluate the trade-offs of the adaptation actions under different budget scenarios, and also best to prepare for storm events for the historical structures. Also, we use the quantitative optimization modeling instead of the traditional prescriptive adaptation planning decision support tool to estimate the cost effectiveness of the funding allocation, so that it could help the funding agencies such as the National Park Service to achieve the maximum effectiveness to maintaining the historical structures, especially when the funding is insufficient. So yeah, that's our primary research approach to address the climate change impacts on cultural resources.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Brownlee, how are you thinking about these questions, that very, very difficult questions that you've raised about us as human beings?
Yeah, and I'll say that I think leisure research for the issues of climate change that we're talking about requires an all hands on deck approach. You know, we need the kind of great projection and modeling work that Dr. Scott has done over time. We need the kind of tourism interface work that has been done by other panelists on here today. And I think that one thing we can rely on confidently in our field is the foundation of work that's been done previous, such as concepts like coping and substitution and constraints, and be able to transfer some of that foundational knowledge to climate change situations. And so I think we do have some theories that have appeared in our literature over time that would work quite well in research for leisure. I think one of our deficit areas where we've been trying to put some effort in the last several years has to do with how people experience climate change. And a lot of the work that I'm involved in has to do with how people are attached to and interact with climate sensitive and climate impacted resources, and how that occurs in real time and real physiological and physical space, in that space of experience. And I think that's something that we probably as a leisure research community have a skill set in order to tackle. And I think that's really important. One of the things that we've begun to do there is to look at how people interact with weather. You know, what is the process in a multiphasic outdoor recreation experience that somebody goes through in their interactions and evaluations of weather? And what does that mean then for weather constraints and negotiation along the way? And when we can understand human behavior and the antecedents to that, we begin to understand more about how maybe outdoor recreation management and planning could change in light of that. So that's one area. The other area is to, I think, begin to think about our outdoor recreation activities as having different levels of weather dependency, that each of them are dependent in some way, although in different ways and different levels, on weather and the resulting conditions. So for example, golf and skiing are both dependent on precipitation, but in different ways and to a different degree. When we can begin to think about activities like that and the factors that contribute to weather dependency, then we can understand potentially those models even better, our projection models even better. And we also can understand that human experience, how people might be adapting through equipment or other modifications because of the degree of weather dependency that exists for the activity of their choice.
Thank you, Matt. I will move over to Lowell. Thoughts on this?
Thank you again. I think I will just follow on, with the discussion, particularly what Matt was just, finishing on. Leisure research, and of course studies, for me, for some of us, we can literally look at it in terms of a person-centered. That means the person, he himself or herself, what basically they're doing, and the place centered. So climate issues basically impacts on people and on how they either want to participate or the attitude they have in terms of doing what they want to do. He mentioned golf and skiing. So things like that, considering whether there is so much precipitation or there is less precipitation. So that basically influences people's participation and also influences people's attitude. On the one hand, that is the case. On the other hand, it's actually also impacting on the place itself. And so that's the environment. I mean, particularly when we are focusing on activities in the outdoor, environment. So the resources that are available for such participation, and indeed the environment upon which that kind of participation, occurs, is also sometimes so much liable to climate, variation. In some areas, we are looking at, adaptation, like Susan have indicated. Some are also going ahead with a little bit of mitigation, which is basically so much more difficult and indeed much more costly, to basically, do. So I will rather see a way in which adaptation can actually be the thing. And I want to look at this example with basically, disasters, if you like, and of course, diseases, because some aspects of the climate phenomena come with diseases. Some other aspects basically create disasters. We are passing through this phenomena of COVID, and we have done that, previously. I remember in 2004 or so, I had a paper during, the SARS pandemic. And when I started looking at it earlier this year, it's basically a similar phenomena that is playing out, because even if they tell you to quarantine or do not quarantine, you find people who are naturally participants are basically going into self-quarantine. But in any case, the health issue is one, the disasters are also others, and these are, if you like, continuous, or rather they have a way of coming back without we people actually, seeing them coming. So we don't anticipate them, but they basically keep coming back, and in that sense, impacting on the way people want to participate in leisure, or indeed on the way they have satisfaction once they participate. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've raised some really critical issues that we're all experiencing and a part of globally right now. Daniel, while you're here, well, let's catch you. I know you're having a little bit of trouble there. Let's catch you.
It's happy hour at Zoom because the rest of my internet seems to be going fine, but for whatever reason, the Zoom connection keeps coming and going. While I get the chance, I'll echo a couple of things Matt had said, both in terms of, first and foremost, as a sector, trying to get more people engaged in actually doing climate change related work. This is one of the biggest challenges we're going to have over the next 30 years. And when I looked, at least in the top 5 tourism journals in the 2000s, less than 1%, or around 1% of articles were climate change related. That's gone up to just below 3%. I don't imagine it's any better in the recreation or broader leisure literature either. So in terms of our capacity contributing to the solutions, we're not doing it as academics. So that's one. Two, I think Matt phrased it differently, but I agree. We need to take better advantage of some of the natural experiments that Mother Nature is giving us. When we have fires, when we have heat waves, we're not studying those to actually see both how operators adapt successfully or learn from our failures, how tourists and recreationists, who's the most vulnerable, we have these opportunities around the world and we're not taking advantage of those. So that's a missed opportunity pretty regularly, unfortunately. And then I'd echo some of the things Suzanne's already probably mentioned. We as a sector need to have a vision of what does leisure look like in a net zero economy in 30 years notionally. Several of our countries have committed to that. Others might be committing to that soon, we'll see. But that's 30 years. That's a huge change. What does that mean in terms of electrification of different types of vehicles and things that we use for leisure, the types of activities we engage in? Those are all huge things. And then I'd say one of the things that we really need to focus now, we're in the implementation phase. We need local level decision relevant information. And by that, I've had, and several of us have probably had that, everything from city councilors to institutional investors to high net worth individuals looking at their real estate investments, looking at what does the community do about these things. And all of that decision making has to have locally driven information. And a lot of the studies that we've done, including myself, we're looking at global, regional, and that's useful from a competition perspective. But to provide them with operational decision making, we need to engage with the communities where we have those relationships and work closer on the ground. And all of our colleagues have those relationships. So we that do have some of the climate change expertise can match up quite well with the people that have all those working relationships. I think we need to do more on that as well.
Yeah, and maybe by benefiting from those relationships, people will pay more attention to some of these issues that we're facing. Kofan, how about you? Thoughts on questions and what we can do to have the greatest impact?
Yes, so glad to hear a lot of insights from other panelists. I really appreciate this opportunity. So something I can observe what our researcher or educator can do is to assess and understand how the practice, either that's from the multiple sectors or from the local communities, we can help our clients or the local residents to build up their resiliency or their adaptive measures to the climate changes. So, and also promote the eco-friendly behaviors. I'm saying that because I have witnessed just this year, because of COVID-19, a lot of international travel has been stopped, restricted, but the domestic travel has become really popular in Taiwan. So a lot of people actually visiting the high elevation areas, which the ecosystem was quite fragile. So I was wondering, when people flood into those areas, the communities or the national park, national forest service, are they ready for taking care of that increasing number of population and also educate land to behave properly in those areas? So I think the personal behavior, personal lifestyles is the fundamental. Just like as Matt mentioned, that's our beliefs, our behaviors, that's lead us to believe lead us to the right decision and the right actions toward the impact of climate change. So that's just my 2 cents here. Thank you.
I think we got a quarter there. I think we got a lot more than 2 cents. Thank you, Kofan.
Thank you.
So there is a point raised in the chat, and I just have to bring it up with the discussion around mitigation and adaptation. You kind of wonder about that. And one of the points was, Dan Henhock says, in my culture, Mohawk, we would make decisions based on thinking 7 generations into the future. And probably that's what we should all be doing right now. And he said, this has definitely impacted how they thought about progress, right? Any comments on that comment? I think it's a really important idea to raise here.
I'll just chime in with something really quick, that I think cultural considerations in this are critically important for several reasons. One, because it's a global issue, but 2, because of the disparities that exist at all levels, local to global. And that I think that the disparity research in other areas like our health sector and financial sector, some of those things, although different contexts, those disparity frameworks and theories and methods apply well to the externalities here and direct effects of climate change. And so I think that the cultural consideration is really important. Dan, I wish that was how we operated, thinking that far ahead generationally. And my final thought with this is that I think we have a lot to learn from each other. in different ways of thinking about this, and that particularly the maybe predominant Western way of thinking about this, that has been more prevalent in the literature and in the media in some ways, needs to be challenged and needs to be thought about a little bit more critically.
Thank you, Matt. Any other thoughts? Suzanne?
Yeah, I might just add the indigenous perspective from New Zealand, from the Maori worldview, because it's really becoming much more mainstream, really, and infused, and we see that actually in the composition of government, but also the rise of the language and practices. But it's really I like the idea of the 7th generation, so I just fully endorse that. The Maori time frame is hundreds, if not 500 years, and that's really what we need to do. But the other one that I really start to learn, and I always thought I'm on the scale of anthropocentric to ecocentric. I thought I'm on the ecocentric spectrum, but that's obviously only within our Western frame. So to really think as being part of the ecosystem, and like some of my Maori colleagues keep reminding me, we're just another species. In fact, we're an invasive species, and we must understand that even saving the ecosystems is not just, it's actually our duty, and not only a transaction to serve us. And so one of the core sayings here is there's a Maori saying, I am the river is I, when the river dies, so will I. And that's embedded so much, and I think that helps us hopefully to turn the boat around a little bit.
Yes, excellent point. And yes, Laura.
Yeah, yes, I just want to add a little bit on the culture thing. I mean, in the African context, you will basically expect to see gender, age, and season, and this is a classical way of putting work and leisure. So working on the rural context, say for example, during planting time or harvesting time, you certainly see singing, dancing, chatting, eating, mixed with basically productive work. And if you look at it on a larger perspective, then certainly those harvesting, planting, and so on totally depend on the precipitation, on rainfall, on climate changes. But there you are with these kind of adaptations, these kind of changes that are happening as a result of climate change. But people locally and culturally will grow up either, through age, from, down to the top, basically singing, enjoying it, and basically working, helping families, and so on. So there is that culture, if you like, of livelihood that is ingrained in the way people do leisure in so many other societies. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, important perspective there. Kofan, did I see you light up over there?
Sorry, I was just scratching my head.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts? I would like to maybe see if Jasmine or Mona or Irna see any other questions that they'd like to raise.
So there is one question in the audience. Given the close alignment of leisure and the environment, governments adapting to climate change need to hear leisure researchers. Thoughts about the need for leisure perspective to be present in Glasgow for COP26 in November 2021.
Happy to give you my 2 cents, maybe even a quarter, Kelly.
Hey, that'd be great.
So it's Daniel here. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And if we look within the IPCC science, often tourism, leisure, et cetera, is sort of the poor sister in the group. For whatever reason, whether it's a Rodney Dangerfield thing or what, either governments, other researchers tend to focus on a lot of the natural resource sectors, cities and things like. Tourism is part of that, and it's certainly part of the economic picture, but it doesn't get the same place within IPCC documents. And similarly, it hasn't had the same place at many of the COP meetings. I know Suzanne shares some of the frustrations that I've had, but also it's a leadership issue. I haven't seen the type of progress, Matt mentioned it, in a nation state context. I haven't seen the type of leadership that I'd want to see out of the UNWTO and some of our supranational organizations to push the tourism and leisure voice, because it is very important. We see some of these energy scenarios that are +2 world compliant, and you look it up and the words leisure, recreation, tourism aren't even mentioned. Like it's not there. Aviation might be, and the assumptions that they make would absolutely crush tourism to the Caribbean, SIDS, and big implications for New Zealand and other places. So there's our sectors that we all contribute to are unfortunately being largely overlooked in too much of the mitigation and adaptation policy. And it's up to us as sectors to engage in that, to bring that voice to bear.
Thank you, Daniel. I know that's one thing we struggle with in the TAPAS group with the IUCN, is to, especially now we're seeing some of the dramatic results of a crisis on protected areas without tourism.
Yes, I just wanted to add that, Kelly, because I think COVID in some ways might be a chance to, well, it has really brought to the forefront the importance of whether it's frontline workers, whether it's the need for leisure and recreation of people, whether it's even that shift from tourism to recreation because people can't fly. I mean, there's so many dimensions where all of a sudden I think you can't ignore it politically, and in the past maybe it was a nice to have for people that's just happening, but now I think it's front and center. I think, Lava, you were going to say the same.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, there is negativity, of course, in COVID, and so on. But the fact that it has brought, out knowledge for people to understand the relevance of closeness, the relevance of proximity, the relevance of domestic, understanding. So I think that will eventually emphasize the need for localizing leisure, if not localizing travel. And to us, somehow, we can see already that some policy makers, or if you like, decision makers, are trying to understand that. So we look forward to seeing that. Of course, like Daniel mentioned, it's a long way, for COP21, COP22, or whatever kind of climate meetings they will have. It's still a long way, but the fact that we are now starting to see domestication of understanding of these contexts in terms of leisure and recreation, I think we will probably be able to have a free path to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt?
I have an additional thought of, some opportunities that we have here, I think, in the leisure service and natural resource, human dimensions and natural resource community. Our parks and protected areas globally are critically important in this, not only as functioning ecologically as carbon sinks and other important harbors of biodiversity and things like that, but they also are critically important socially. We're at a time now globally where more people live in municipal and environments and cities than ever before. And those types of environments are largely climate controlled, fairly resilient and or resistant, to climate impacts. And people can kind of detach themselves from impacts that may be occurring. However, in parks and protected areas, even though climate impacts or processes that are being impacted may not be readily noticeable to an average visitor or tourist to a protected area, it does provide a great foundation and a great backdrop to help educate about how processes are being influenced outside of people's regular city environment, which again is fairly climate controlled and protected. And so I think that one of the things we can do as educators in that process is to help students that are going to operate in those kind of environments as park rangers or environmental educators, not to just understand climate change, but to be empowered with the opportunity that's before them in their career.
Thank you, Matt. I do want to raise a couple of questions that are in the chat. One question is, it is difficult to promote recreation and leisure and to also be environmentally aware to minimize impacts. Any thoughts? Any thoughts from the panel? I think that's what visitor management is about, maybe. And
yeah, but you
Yeah.
can certainly do, yeah, you can certainly do both. And some, I think, to Matt and other people's points about finding our voice, and I think one of the other questions asked the same sort of thing. We're really starting to see that in some of the NGOs. So Protect Our Winters is one example in the US and Canada and other parts of the world. That's the outdoor industry, the people who are in our parks that started with skiers and the athletes. But they are one of the strongest voices from our sector. They're advocating in Washington and in state legislators. They are getting into schools with the Hot Planet Cool athletes. They're educating our students about what it means locally. So we can work with them, absolutely. But they foster both. A lot of the athletes that go into schools, they tell their story of their journey of what they're seeing happen on the landscape, just like some of our Indigenous elders and farmers. They see these landscape changes because they've been out there for 30, 40 years as coaches and things like that. They're telling that story and how it's driven them to do things differently, to be more sustainable in their activities as it relates to their sport or their outdoor, but also their lives. So you can absolutely do both. And there's good examples of people that are trying to do that and sort of walk the talk.
I think what Laval said earlier about the closeness, again, being a huge opportunity, and just this morning, because my time is favorable, it's 11 o'clock here in New Zealand, so I was out already to hunt 2 penguins. We've got this, seems to be a global thing, wild in cities, where you hunt sculptures. I have never done this, but it's a wonderful thing. There's 120, and you're encouraged to find them all either by bike or on foot. And it's in some ways, again, linking in with the COVID situation, because people are not going anywhere, people have time, people actually look for things to do with their kids. Competition is wonderful. Of course, we try to get as many as possible, and it gets you out there. And if it's combined with stories, I mean, there's obviously also, again, I mentioned Indigenous culture earlier. We've got some dressed up with, you know, as Kias and Kiwis and with Maori design. So it's actually a great initiative. So again, it's this opportunity that we have from COVID to use leisure close to home as a way to reconnect with nature and culture, and ideally, of course, low carbon.
Thank you. Jasmine or Irna or Mona, do you have other questions you'd like to raise?
Yes, there is another question chat by Richard. What can we do from a global leisure studies collective to advance our voice to governments, business, and community about climate change?
Great question. Who would like to take that? Lowell?
Yes, I think this is a very good point they are raising. We've just identified the fact that, as Daniel indicated, you know, in many of these high-level discussions, certainly tourism and leisure in many cases are not given, you know, the right, you know, recognition that they should. I mean, tourism started becoming well received, of course, after, you know, the money that it generates became something that almost every country or every community basically wants to take a little bit of. And then when carbon emissions are basically being discussed, then people again started bringing out the fact that, oh, tourism also causes a little emissions, and so on. Even though when you compare with transportation, then you basically see the other way. But back to this question, I think there is a good opportunity for partnership, certainly with businesses and indeed with communities. There are communities both in developing countries and in developed countries that basically need, leisure, for example, to uplift the society. I mean, some of the things that we do in World Leisure Organization, with, for example, the World Leisure Games that we have, hosted in different communities, they've basically transformed the communities, and there are examples where, for example, infrastructure for participation was not available before the games, and basically afterwards the legacy is that people now realize the need for leisure, the need for becoming healthy by participation, and not necessarily being competitive to win, but basically being competitive to feel good, to advance the health, to become, one group in a community, and basically, things like that. So that's basically linking up, government and businesses, and I would like to see, a way, or rather, a situation whereby the decision makers and the policy makers are basically bringing this concept on the table, because it is very much clear. I mean, I've been to a, to a certain place, I think somewhere in China, and I was surprised to see 70-year-old women basically playing basketball. And they were very happy doing it. They thought I played basketball. They beat me to it. I couldn't do this. So that's the kind of thing I'm basically talking about. So there is opportunity for governments to basically to take the lead. There is also the opportunity for businesses to basically to partner, and to some extent, we as academics might be able to do something as well.
Thank you. Yes, Chiao. Sorry, you're muted.
I want to add some points regarding to this question too. Is that I think to advocate advocate our voice regarding to climate change is really important to highlight the impact, and also to work with the government and local communities when we were developing some of the decision support tools for adaptation planning process, to really involve their voices, like kind of in our researches, we trying to involve our the voices from the visitors and local community residents, and also third-party users, so like that their voices could be represented in the decision support process, and also to kind of developing some of the advanced new decision support tools to help them project the climate impact, or also to or other kind of like climate index to help those stakeholders to better aware the climate change impact would be very helpful to advocate our voices about climate change.
Terrific. I believe we have another question.
Kelly, can I just add one
Yeah, please.
additional thought to that? First, one thing I'd encourage all of us as academics to do is get your voice in. There's lots of processes that are free to just add your expertise. Right now, the IPCC Working Group 2 review is started, opened up today. We've got about 2 weeks. Go and look, either your region that the best, part of the world, the other chapters. What is the state of the tourism and recreation knowledge in those documents? And if it's not there, call them out. Do the same thing on your national assessments. If there's not a tourism and recreation leisure chapter, call it out, tell them what information is out there. We're not doing that enough. And so often it's climate change experts leading these things that don't know anything about tourism or leisure. Suzanne did some really great work on policy, and we found the same sorts of things there, that the leadership on climate and policy nexus was being led by climate change people, not by the tourism people. But you can sort of influence both. And then, to be absolutely crass, the more you can make a business case to it, if you go to the ski resort operator, the local councillor, and tell them what it means economically, they will listen to you. And you have those often local to regional relationships already. So if you can put it in terms that which is often what we don't do particularly well, put it in terms that they need to hear, performance metrics and things like that they need to hear, they will listen.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle.
And we have a couple of questions here. So one is more I would say comment that in Puerto Rico, the government is maybe not taken seriously, neither climate change, nor it seems like academics, particularly in recreation profession. So if you have any comments on that collaboration between government and our profession, we kind of talked about this a little bit. And then second, I guess, question is overconsumption and overproduction are the main drivers of climate change. Leisure activities, we promote, perpetuate the problem. What is our role as researchers or educators to change the discourse?
I mean, I think some of that has to do with larger initiatives. Some of the stuff that Kelly Bricker has been involved in with helping, for sustainable tourism indicators. And those kind of initiatives are time intensive. They don't necessarily produce results right away, but they help change a big ship moving it in a different direction. And I think having the courage to take those things on is really important in our field. The issue we're talking about is arguably the most challenging issue perhaps that we've faced as humanity. And so we cannot expect that there will be one answer or one scale of initiatives. So I think that's an important aspect too. Kelly, I don't know if you want to talk about the sustainable tourism indicators and.
Yeah, and I think Suzanne has worked on global indicators as well, but certainly with the Global Sustainable Tourism Council criteria that started back in 2008, it's moved from not only individual tourism operators and hotels, but to destination level strategies that people can take. And a big thread throughout all three of those ideas is sustainable consumption and production. And certainly the IUCN environmental program has taken that on as a main focus, and we're trying to figure out different ways to engage the tourism industry or industry at large, leisure industry, in addressing some of these issues and how we can mitigate some of that. So yeah, I think, and that criteria is a starting place. It's not the answer. The gold standard is certification, which hasn't been picked up very well, but it's starting to, and certainly during COVID, governments from nations all around the world have reached out to get more training in these areas and really consider this. So I'm pretty excited about the uptake at a government level, which will help. You've got to have the top and the bottom up approaches to make a difference, as you noted that. Looks like Suzanne might want to say something.
I might add, because I think it's an excellent question, and it goes to the heart of the problem, and in some ways the economic system that we have created for ourselves. And one thing that strikes me, I mean, just the same for tourism and leisure, that there's a real I mean, in some ways, industry has hijacked the human need for something like we want to, whether it's tourism or leisure, we have, these are human needs of regenerating ourselves or getting together with loved ones or experiencing stuff. And then comes in the industry dimension, in some ways as a facilitator, but also I think it has become almost an autopilot of where, I mean, a lot of leisure activities these days are so closely tied to consumption. I mean, whether it's yoga and you have to buy the right pants and shoes, and I mean, you can't do a leisure activity without buying the right stuff for it these days. And of course, there's a purpose because it stimulates economic growth and so on. So to disentangle that a bit again, and say, okay, well, why can't we do a lot of these things without consuming? That in itself, of course, it can't be done in an isolated way because it demands different economic models where then you don't have unintended use. So you need to change the system in quite a purposeful way. But anyway, I think it's a great question. And I think if we can, I guess it comes back to, I mean, one question I've asked myself as a tourism researcher, is it, who am I researching for? Is it for the industry? Is it for the environment, or is it for the people who actually want to engage? You know, because each of those are slightly different takes in terms of how you approach it and who you get funding from, etc. Anyway, so it's a great question.
Thank you. Looks like we have another question. What can World Leisure, ANZELS, CALS, TALS, LSA do to assist leisure scholars in regard to advancing our voice with respect to climate change? I think we've touched on some ideas, but other thoughts on that?
I can offer one more. Just, I think strengthening your voice internally is one. There's not enough people within our respective organizations, the journals we all contribute to, the journals we read, that see enough about this stuff. And in the same way with public, one of the more recent research, how do you influence people on climate change who either disbelieve it or are skeptical of it? The more often they see it from more voices and the more germane it is to their real world life, the more apt they're going to actually change some of their perceptions of it. So the more we see it in some of our journals, if we have special sessions, if we have keynote speakers at some of our conferences, how many of those, I think World Leisure, I think I gave a talk to once, but how many of those have had keynotes or special sessions related to climate change? So we can start internally, but also then you can take that voice externally as well. But I think you need a critical mass of both expertise and vocal people internally, as it would be a good, strong starting point.
Yeah, it seems like it should be a common thread in all that we think about these days, right? And somehow make it palatable. You can also have elections, that helps.
Yeah, I totally second what you said there, Daniel and Kelly. I do think some of it starts internally, and I think some of the mechanisms are fairly easy to enact. So special issues. Every conference should probably have a climate change track. We should be thoughtful about keynote speakers. We should integrate climate change discussions, planning frameworks, and scenarios into our coursework and into our curriculum. And so I think these are all actual individual actions that we can take, either at a course level if we're teaching something, or if we're on a steering or planning committee for a conference. These are things that we can begin to do. If we serve as associate editors or editors for a journal, this is an influence that we have to promote special issues. And so I think these are all things we can do internally and have the agency to do so.
Can I possibly ask the follow-up question? Because I think that I had this discussion in our class this past semester, and I have never experienced people so openly, claiming that this is just fake news or just kind of how do you speak to people who completely disregard and actually provide some resources that maybe not obviously reliable, but still believe that even 2% of scientists who maybe disagree with that is still have the right to be heard, and they choose to believe kind of that line of thinking? How do you talk to somebody like that, and how do you kind of change minds? Because I feel like that's our maybe contribution as educators.
That's a great question, and I'm the director of our Master of Climate Change program, and that's one of the things we actually train our students to do. And so I'd put you on to, so Yale and a few other, the Yale Climate Change Communication Center has some great tools on that. Sort of, it's how do you have a discussion with deniers, and I would say it's not a one conversation change. Those who are locked into that line of thinking, you're not going to win that argument over dinner. So be prepared for that. You can look at the sort of 10 common lines and then say, okay, well, here's the evidence against that. So you can be well prepared for those discussions, but no, it'll be very difficult. And it's, Matt mentioned some of the barriers to that, and it's often communities that people engage in, they don't want to take a contrary view to that. So even if they are absolutely intelligent people, they're university professors, they're CEOs or whatever, it's partly the community in which they operate and live in that is driving some of that disbelief, or they don't want to be outside that community group. But I'd start you there. Yale and a few others have some really good resources and some good sort of briefing documents that are pretty concise in terms of how to have those conversations and what the common climate change denier arguments will be that you can prepare for if you want.
Yeah, it seems like we have to make it personal too, right? We have to somehow make it relatable and not this giant thing that we can't as individuals contribute to. But if we can make it relatable to our day to day, we can maybe make some headway there as well. There's another, Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think having the conversation is important and being a good listener. So, everybody's entitled to their belief and opinion. And I think we can, the one way to keep that conversation going with people that may have a different belief or opinion than we do, or that the scientific community does, then is to just continue that conversation and try to understand more about the thinking that is behind whatever that individual is communicating.
Yeah, I just want to add that, the conversation is going well, and there are quite a few ways of basically addressing this. I teach a few courses related to that. Sometimes I'm not sure if any one of you knows George Carlin. George Carlin, the comedian who passed away. Now, he has one clip, I think, on biodiversity and climate change, sort of related. It's 8 minutes. And he's totally against the notion that we will save the earth or we will save the planet. So he comes out with quite a few, examples, and you will laugh for the 8 minutes he will be talking, because he's making some sense, but it's parody. So when I have a group of people, students, who basically are naysayers, so they look at that and then we have a discussion afterwards. And I found it, useful, because they will now come back and say, oh, now we understand what all this, is all about. So yes, there is reading, and there is also pushing people into the direction of critical thinking. I mean, there are examples every day. I mean, some of us have seen rivers before that were flowing, and then all of a sudden now, 20 years later, the rivers are dried. I mean, you don't have to tell me there is a science behind that. I'm seeing it myself. We've seen some places are experiencing different aspects of weather phenomena that probably have passed away, X number of years ago. I mean, there are examples that, people just have to open up and basically look at the details, see the data, see what is happening, and then, but then of course there are those who are really deniers, and they will not believe whatever is happening. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have one more question in the chat, which we'll try to get to. We have a few minutes left. Do you think the leisure industry will suffer a change from outdoor recreation to indoor recreation because of climate change, or will we find a way to save it? A lot of virtual things going on out there. Any final thoughts from our panelists? We have about 4 minutes left.
We will absolutely save at least parts of it. But it raises an important point that climate change is going to interact with a whole bunch of other things that influence leisure and recreation, whether it's going to sort of virtual environments in some cases, whether it's economic and demographic, geographic, political shifts. So it's going to interact with all of those things. To understand leisure futures is a real challenge. Climate change will definitely be part of it, and we do see some of those concerns for particular sports like the ski industry, etc. If you take that away and you take it away regularly enough, do you get the same number of young athletes entering that sport? If seasons change and you can't practice down in Clemson, etc., when you've got heat warnings in the early fall and football becomes a more difficult thing, whether it's long distance running, the list goes on and on. So you will definitely see shifts in it. But I think the fundamentals of what we have as an outdoor leisure industry will still be there. Some will be in different forms, but we're not going to be indoor animals anytime soon. At least I hope not.
And that's where I think some of that foundational leisure literature, around substitutability, activity substitutability, temporal substitutability, resource substitutability, those are good things to help answer those really tough questions. So I also am not convinced that stable states are real. That stable states are a bit of a hologram, and I think that we live in a dynamic world outside and inside of ourselves, ecologically and socially. And so I think it's just a continual process of change and adjustment.
Anyone else? Well, I think I will take the minute left that we have and just give a heartfelt thanks to these wonderful panelists we had here today, representing organizations from all over the world. It's truly a delight to hear your perspectives and the challenges that we face. I'd also like to thank the support team that's always there, checking chat, checking Q&A. We can't do it without you, so thank you. And thank you, participants, for being here and raising important questions and comments surrounding this issue. We look forward to seeing you in January and wish everyone a wonderful holiday season, however and wherever you may be celebrating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.